Thank you again for joining today's webinar on humanitarian protection. This is the third in a series of 6 webinars on age and disability inclusion in humanitarian action. Today's moderator is Caterina Luciani. Caterina is the co-chair of the Global Protection Cluster's Task Team on Learning and Roving Training Officer at UNHCR. With a background in international law and affairs and with work experience in international and non-governmental organizations alike, Caterina has been working on humanitarian capacity building for the past 5 years. Her areas of expertise as trainer and facilitator include protection, international humanitarian law, protection of civilians, principled humanitarian action, and humanitarian access. Now I will pass over to Caterina.
Thank you, Anna, and good morning and good afternoon to all of you. And thank you for joining us today for this webinar. Thank you, Anna, for introducing me. As a facilitator for this webinar today, I would like to start with introducing our 2 guest experts. We're joined today by Emanuela Rizzo, who has 10 years experience in managing humanitarian responses in the Middle East and East Africa, as well as recently responding to the crisis in Ukraine. Her area of expertise is humanitarian protection, and currently she is the Emergency Programme Coordinator and Protection Advisor at HelpAge International. So, Emanuela, welcome.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Caterina.
Our second guest expert is Francesca Ballarin, who has an extensive experience in child protection programming in disaster and post-conflict situations. Since 2003, she has been actively involved in the development, monitoring, and dissemination of quality and accountability initiatives. Francesca is an independent consultant and the sphere focal point in Italy. Francesca, thank you for joining us today. Now, let's delve into today's topic. In 2015, the Age and Disability Capacity Building Program, ADCAP, launched the first minimum standards for age and disability inclusion in humanitarian action. The standards were conceived to inform the design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of humanitarian programs in order to ensure that older people and people with disabilities are included and receive accessible and appropriate assistance. During this webinar, our guest experts will analyze the drivers of vulnerability for older people and people with disabilities in emergency contexts. Moreover, Emanuela and Francesca will look at how the protection imperative has shifted from being an exclusive sphere of action for mandated agencies, such as UNHCR and the ICRC, to be an integral part of responses of mainstream agencies. Emanuela and Francesca will discuss different humanitarian contexts to illustrate the issues and give examples of how protection programs can successfully include older people and those with disability. They will be asking you, our participants, to actively engage through short exercises and case studies. Whether with a pencil and paper or through the chat on this online platform, we hope that you will participate in these exercises with us. Before I leave the floor to the first speaker, I would like to encourage you all, our participants, to submit your questions through the chat window at any time. The chat window is on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll collect your questions throughout the presentation and save them for the questions and answers part of this webinar after the presentation. So, Emanuela, I will now hand over to you so you can start with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Caterina, and good morning once again to everybody. We would like to start today talking about protection of vulnerable groups and how sector standards can help us in this effort by having a shared conceptual framework. And in order to do so, we would like to start from the definition of protection. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the definition we are using today, which is the ICRC and then IASC adopted definition, all activities aimed at ensuring full respect for the rights of the individual in accordance with the letter and spirit of the relevant bodies of law, human rights law, humanitarian law, and refugee law. This is a definition that is quite broad in terms and scope, and does recognize that protection is not an exclusive element of mandated agencies such as ICRC or UNHCR, but recognize the work that has been done and is promoted by many other generalist agencies. Therefore, protection in this definition is seen as a complementary and systemic effort of the wider humanitarian community. The strong element of this definition is the strong emphasis on the rights-based approach that is embedded in it. However, this definition is also recognizing that there are other elements of protection that we should carefully look at every time we decide to go into the field and start our programming, and are elements of safety, security, and humanitarian access, as well as assistance. This later part is even more relevant given the work many of us are doing in the local to global protection and by using community-based protection approaches. Protection is also characterized by other three concepts. The concept of threat as any entity, action, or event, whether natural or man-made, that has the potential to cause violence, coercion, or deliberate deprivation. The concept of vulnerability, which look at the characteristics of a person or group in terms of their capacity to anticipate, cope with, resist, and recover from the impact of a natural or man-made hazard. And the risk, the probable negative consequences of the hazard as a result of inherent vulnerability, expressed in terms of expected loss of life, people injured, property and livelihoods damaged, economic activity disrupted, or environmental damage. Of course, I have used the three definitions that has been adapted from the IFRC and the Red Crescent societies. Now, why it's important to look at these three concepts, and specifically I would like to drive your attention to the concept of vulnerability, because it's central to our analysis today, and also is central in order to deliver a protection work that meets the needs and the request of our affected community. Vulnerability, as the definition suggests, has a lot to do with the characteristics of an individual. And furthermore, vulnerability, given the very articulated elements in it, is a multidimensional and a dynamic element. And these are the elements that we should look at when we do our analysis. And when we look at how to engage in a protection response, we know very well that our main instrument is what we call our risk equation. And if we do not understand what are the threats and what are the risks and what are the vulnerabilities, we would not be able to work out what is our risk equation, and therefore we won't be able to provide an effective and efficient as well as inclusive response. I will now leave the floor to Francesca, who will guide us through an exercise that will help us to understand better what is vulnerability and how we would be able to recognize the vulnerability. Over to you, Francesca.
Thank you, Emanuela, and good morning, all of you. Happy to be here. I guess you didn't hear my hello before. So as Emanuela just said, vulnerability is a key concept in understanding protection. And we would then like to involve you in a reflection about vulnerability. In the slide on your screen, you see three different situations of vulnerability. We see the one on the top that shows two children in a Malakal IDP camp in South Sudan. That is an old woman in a in an area in a conflict in Ukraine, and there is a disabled person in Somalia. So we would like for each of the situations to think about what are the factors that lead to vulnerability. And I will allow 1 minute so that you can reflect individually on each picture, and then we can come back and share some ideas. I give you some few seconds now. Okay, let's come back together and see what ideas might be popped up. For sure, some of the elements that we can think of, among many others, are about who those people are and in which situation they live. And indeed, the factors for vulnerability could be grouped into environmental factors, social and economical factors, and identity factors. Environmental factors depend on the context where people physically live. Is this an urban context? Is this a rural context? What services exist? Is medical care available? Is electricity available? What is the climate? Social factors reflect the structure of the family, the interaction between the groups, the support networks, does it exist or not, up to the overall structure of the society at large. While economic factors are, of course, relating to income and livelihood opportunities. Then there are finally identity factors that relate to who you are, your gender, your age, what type of diversity you bring in. Some of the examples that, among many others, that could have come to your mind when reflecting on the pictures could be, for example, for the picture showing the two children in the plastic shelter, that their physical vulnerability could be relating to the camp setting, the fact that they live in a camp itself, the density of the population in the camp, their housing conditions. Elements of social vulnerability might be linked to the presence or not of family members, their parents, but also the extended family, while the environmental vulnerability could be linked to the improper waste management or the availability of educational opportunities. For the second picture, the one showing the old woman, her physical vulnerability could be relating to housing conditions, for example, and the fact that unexploded remnants of wood could be nearby. Her social vulnerability could be relating to the loss of livelihood access or loss of social benefits, while her social vulnerability could be related to the loss of family members. Finally, for the person with disability, his physical vulnerability could be relating to the remoteness of the services or of the place where the person lives, the physical access to the services themselves. And while his social vulnerability could be relating to the legal status this person has, or to the stigma of the society on persons with disabilities, and his identity vulnerability could be relating to his diversity. there's a gender dimension that we wanted to highlight that goes throughout the categories and that makes people different in different ways, being a man or being a woman. And indeed, identifying who are the most vulnerable is a key exercise for protection in the humanitarian response. So women, children, people with disability, older people are often among the most vulnerable in each humanitarian crisis. Now, let's put ourselves in the shoes of possible categories of people affected by a disaster and reflect more thoroughly about how differently people are vulnerable. In this slide, we describe 6 characters. So let's go through them one by one. I will point at the arrow at the character that we are describing. And for each one, I will be asking you to vote if in your opinion the character is very vulnerable or not. Let me just remind you the instructions to vote. Just above the chat box, you have 2 signs, a green check and a red arrow. So you can click on a right check, on a green check, sorry, if your answer is yes, or the red X if your answer is not. And I will be collecting the polling. So for the situation number 1, we put ourselves in the shoes of an 8-year-old child. You are deaf, your family knows the sign language, and you attend the school where you can use accessible material. Yes or no, do you feel you are vulnerable or not? People voting, I still give you some seconds to vote. Okay, I'll keep track of your vote. Let's go to and then we'll discuss it at the end of the exercise. Let's go to the situation number 2. We are now a farmer. Your fields are in a dangerous area and you risk of being wounded or killed if you go there. But if you don't go there, your family will go hungry. Do you believe you are vulnerable or not? Okay. Voting completed. Third situation. You are now a 10-year-old girl. You live in an orphanage and rarely have enough to eat. Sometimes you are beaten. You're vulnerable or not? Okay. Done. Fourth situation. You are a married man with 4 children running a food shop in a small town. You lost an arm in a war, but you have a good income. You're vulnerable or not? Thank you very much for voting this one as well. Fifth situation. You're an old couple living with their children being displaced but still receiving a pension and good access to health services. Are you vulnerable or not? Thanks a lot. Last character. We are now an 82-year-old man living alone with no pension and separated from his relatives living in a different country. Let's see. Voting. Okay. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everybody, to participating in this exercise. So, as in this slide you see in bold those characters that were actually the most vulnerable, and this perfectly aligned with the results of your voting. And thank you very much for taking for your engagement in this as well. What is important in this exercise to highlight is that vulnerability is also a matter of capacity and resources to cope. So sometimes we are driven by stereotypes about vulnerability. We have to make contextual analysis of who is vulnerable in a given situation or not. And this is the multidimensional and evolving nature of the vulnerability concept itself. Now, during the humanitarian crisis, be it conflict, political violence, or natural disaster, the chaos abounds, and the social, economical, political, cultural, and physical structures and infrastructure can collapse. People can be displaced from their home and with fear. In such climate, the existing inequalities, the ethnic tensions, and the deprivation are amplified. And of course, in this situation, those who are already vulnerable become increasingly vulnerable. So in this context, people require not only material assistance, but also protection. And as Emanuela stated on the beginning of the session, protection has to do with safety and security, with access to humanitarian assistance and human rights. In this slide, you see some examples of the most common protection concerns that are recurring in the humanitarian setting. These concerns could be separation from the families, where families are unable to live together or to be reunited, the neglect and deprivation of those who are more in need of care, violence in general, but specifically against children and against women, the deliberate killing, wounding, displacement, and disappearance of civilians, gender-based violence and sexual-based violence against women, forced prostitution, the lack of proper documentation, like the loss of birth certificates, identity cards, documents proving ownership of lands, the arbitrary restriction of movement and forced return, forced recruitment into armed forces, torture and inhuman treatment, discrimination in the access to assistance, to health, to education, to water, to economic opportunity. Thirst, anger, diseases caused by the deliberate destruction of services or denial of livelihoods. The restriction on political and religious freedom, the use of landmines, the discrimination against minorities, sexual exploitation and abuse by peacekeepers and humanitarian staff, and the limited access to markets or fields. I will now give the floor back to Emanuela, who will guide you through a reflection on how protection concerns can apply to different categories of people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesca. Yeah, what I would like to do with you is to look at 3 different groups and basically looking at older people, people with disability, and children, and thinking about the sectors. And for sectors, I mean what we have considered as cluster sectors: protection, food, shelter and NFIs, wash, emergency education, health, and nutrition. And thinking about this, and now I will remove the slide, I would like you to consider what would be the protection concerns that older people, people with disability, and children may face in a humanitarian emergency, thinking about the sectors as I have described. So I give you a couple of seconds, you can note this down, and then I will guide you through some examples. Well, let's start from children. And we know we are all quite familiar with protection issues faced by children, and we all look at family separation as the first concern. But recently, I would like to remind you that there are elements such as child labor or early marriages that are becoming increasingly a concern of the humanitarian sector. And then if we look at more specific sectors protection concerns, if we look, for instance, at WASH, having difficulties using sanitation facilities, we always forget about how is accessibility impacting the capacity of people in making use and having an effective use of what we provide. If we look at emergency education, lack of age-appropriate education opportunities, and this is relevant for children, but also for older people as well. Continuous education is always a very huge concern in all the emergency setting. And then let's go to the 2 groups that are usually overlooked in an emergency context: older people and people with disability. And please bear with me because I would like to spend a bit more time on these 2 groups. People with disability, protection concern in the protection sector, being separated from family or communities, and gender-based violence are 2 of the main concerns when we look at people with disability. We keep forgetting that they face difficulties in fleeing from a conflict, fleeing from a natural disaster, and they might be left behind. When we look at food, let's think about our way of distributing food. The long queue, the distribution point, so having difficulty in reaching the food distribution point or the market is something that we have always to have in mind when we decide how we do distribution and what modalities would be more inclusive than others. Shelter and NFIs, having accessible shelters. We have standards for shelters, and there has been recently a great effort by NRC to make sure, especially in Ukraine, that all shelter provision are accessible for people with disability as well as older people. Emergency education. Let's think about children with disability and how difficult it is for them to be included in education services, so not being targeted by life-saving awareness programs as well. Health and nutrition, lack of specialized medical services, and let's think also about services like mental health services. Older people, again, we keep forgetting that older people are frail and they might not be able to flee at the time when it is required. Or food, having difficulty transporting the food back home, but also having difficulties in using the food that is provided. Shelter and NFIs being grouped with unknown people. wash not being included in water distribution schemes because we assume that they are part of a family and family will provide for them. Is not that true. And then health and nutrition, having malnutrition unchecked and untreated. How many times we have seen in places like South Sudan or recently in the crisis in Ethiopia, older people not being targeted by services and not even being checked. So they completely go underscored and under-recorded. So those are few of the examples. I'm sure you might have thought about many other examples of protection concerns for these three groups. But what I would like to pass to you with this exercise is that affected communities, in many cases, are considered as a homogeneous group. And the analysis of the gender, the age, the disability, and other aspects of diversity of the population is most of the time missed. And I would like just to share with you the result of a research that was conducted in 2013, and this year there will be a second edition by HelpAge International and Handicap International on disasters and diversity, a study of humanitarian financing for older people and children under 5. This research gives us two main information. One of the first things that says the research is that experienced humanitarian staff tend to base decisions mainly on past experiences, instincts, and assumptions, which is not a good thing, even when assessment is viewed as a priority for program planning. This may lead to program inertia, and whereby certain types of programs will inevitably be chosen due to individual biases, assumptions, and preferences to the disadvantage of vulnerable groups. And the second evidence that is provided by this research is about number and how the system addresses issues of vulnerable groups. And the three vulnerable groups analyzed in this research are older people, people with disability, and children under 5. And surprisingly, through the consolidated appeal process, 2010-2011, over all the projects submitted for older people, only 0.78% include at least one activities that was targeting needs of older people, and only 0.3% of them got funded. Similarly, for people with disability, 1.6% of the projects submitted had an activity dedicated to people with disability or addressing their needs, and only 0.7% were funded. And children under 5, bit better, but not that much. 3.9% of projects submitted included activities for children under 5, and only 2.3% were funded. Now, this scenario is not extremely encouraging, but the sector is doing a lot to improve on this side, and is doing a lot by developing standards that would enable to put affected communities at the centers and looking at the accountability and the quality of the protection work. And here it comes the value of the age and disability minimum standards for inclusion. Now, the age and disability minimum standards do not come as an additional layer for us, as for the practitioner, to add additional emphasis on just tick boxing, but they would like to spell out clearly how it's important to address vulnerabilities of people with disability, older people, as well as having in mind the gender component of our implementation. And what we have decided to do is to show you how age and disability minimum standards are complementary to other sector standards. And we have decided to use the protection standards of ICRC, the Sphere Protection Principle and Core Standards, Protection Mainstreaming Action, Core Humanitarian Standards, as well as Child Protection Minimum Standards in Humanitarian Action. As you can see in the slide, on the left column, we have the 7 standards of the minimum standards for age and disability inclusion in humanitarian action focusing on the protection sector. And then we have used a color coding where the darker shades show the full complementarity between the age and disability minimum standard and the other standard. And the lighter the shade becomes, more distant becomes the complementarity. But as you can see, in most of the cases, in 90% of the cases, are absolutely complementary. And what is absolutely important to highlight is that those standards will help us out in remembering that older people, people with disability, are part of the community we are addressing. So, as a last part of this webinar, before moving to the Q&A, I would like to show you one best practice, which is a Jordan case studies. This was a work done in partnership between Handicap International and HelpAge International on the use of the age and disability minimum standards and how you can really be inclusive. And I would like you to consider this case study by looking at the protection standard number 2 of the age and disability minimum standards. Humanitarian actors make all possible efforts to ensure safe, inclusive, and protective environment for older people and people with disability affected by crisis. And these groups play a full role in community-level protection action. And in protection standard number 3, where people with disability and older people and their carers have full access to protection services and to all information relevant to their protection. How Handicap International and HelpAge have been able to do so? They receive a grant from the EC and the FID, and they have established community and camp-based volunteers group. These groups were meant to support the identification of the most vulnerable individuals and to ensure that information on access to services was provided. In addition, the group supported community resilience and strengthening community-oriented coping mechanisms to impact of the Syrian crisis. Now, the composition of the groups is the important part of all of it. They were comprised of Syrian refugees, women and men, members of those communities, so Jordanians, older person, person with injuries and or person with disabilities. And the community groups worked on a voluntary basis with occasional logistical facilitation from Handicap International and HelpAge. And what they were doing was basically disseminating information, provide peer-to-peer support, identifying and of individual protection concerns, which were not just the protection concern of older people or people with disabilities, but was the affected community as a whole. And then identification of community and camp-based age and disability-related vulnerabilities and other protection concerns affecting women and men. And the identification was done through home visits, community meetings, and the regular interaction between the members of the groups and communities. So this is a way that has been used to implement and to integrate the minimum standards on age and disability within other wider sectoral standards. And so what we can see is that these two standards were complementing the standard 8 of the professional standards for protection work of ICRC and the commitment 4 of the CHS. So you will have in the current presentation and other best practice on it's a Ukraine case study. I'm not gonna go very deep on this, but in the Ukraine case study, you will see that is a work done at system level. So it was the establishment of a technical working group on aging and disability with the idea of making sure that humanitarian organizations identify and address specific protection concerns affecting people with disabilities and older people, including exclusion from services and assistance. And this was done because one of the assessments showed that 82% of the surveyed older people and people with some sort of disability by June 2015, so almost halfway through the crisis in Ukraine didn't receive yet any form of aid. And they were among the most vulnerable because they didn't have access to any other sort of support. So I hope these two case studies have shown you how you can use the standards and how you can integrate the standards within other sector standards. And I pass now the floor to Caterina. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesca and Emanuela. Before I start with the many questions we've been receiving from our participants, I would like to briefly highlight what I think we can consider being the three main messages of your presentation today. First of all, I believe we can say that our work in ensuring protection of affected communities should be guided by a sound understanding of the multidimensional aspects of vulnerability. That is, the understanding of the social, economic, political, and identity elements that together determine the capacity of an individual or group to withstand, respond, and cope with a crisis. Secondly, drawing from our experts' presentations, it's clear that age and gender determine a person's status and consequently determine the person's access to resources and decision-making power. So proper identification of specific vulnerabilities linked to gender, age, and diversity becomes key to a correct identification of protection concerns, which in turn allows us to address needs in an accountable and effective way. The third point is indeed about accountability and effectiveness, and the age and disability minimum standards are a tool that can guide agencies to ensure overall coverage of the humanitarian response. As Emanuela correctly pointed out, standards are not to be a mere tick boxes exercise, but they're supposed to be, and they should be used as an effective effort towards a more inclusive approach within the wider humanitarian community. So I believe these are the three main key messages, takeaway messages that we want to make sure that you, our participants to today's webinar, can bring back with you after signing off from this webinar. And I believe we now have around 15 minutes for questions. And I would like to start with a question for Emanuela. So Emanuela, at the beginning of the presentation, you have spoken about the important relation between vulnerability and the local to global protection approach. So the question was indeed about how, if you could possibly further elaborate on this nexus between vulnerability and the local to global approach. Emanuela, over to you.
Thank you, Caterina. Yes, recently we have all been working more and more on community-based protection, and the approach from local to global protection has been widely presented by many agencies. In first place, UNHCR, but many other generalist agencies have been working on local to global protection. And when you work on local to global protection, you work with the communities that, as we know, are the first responders and the first element for their own protection. And they identify protection most of the time not in the same way we identify protection. So we need to be ready to read and understand what are considered the threats and the vulnerabilities that the community itself recognize and consider the main element that may trigger negative or safety issues vis-a-vis to what we consider as protection concerns that may not, as I said, be on the same line with what communities recognize as protection concern. Therefore, if we run our adequate vulnerability analysis and we listen, so we have an inclusive approach, looking at all the different members of the community and not just those who are easily accessible, because might be those who come forward, by then we will be able to have a proper response and making sure that all those who are less visible, and I'm talking about people with disabilities, older people, children, women, they are able to have their voice heard. Thank you, Caterina.
Thank you very much, Emanuela. We received a question from Saili, and I think that both Emanuela and Francesca are maybe interested in answering. And she asked, or he asked, apologies if I didn't say it right, what are the typical mistakes, those wrong approaches that are often seen in humanitarian protection for older people and people with disability? I think it's interesting to see, aside from the good practices, also what are the common mistakes, common oversights. So maybe, Emanuela, I hand over to you first.
Sorry, Caterina, I had some audio issues. Could you just repeat the question?
Of course. So a participant is asking if you could give us a few examples of some wrong practices that are often seen in the humanitarian sector when responding to older people and people with disabilities needs, to be able to better keep them in track.
Yeah, one of the things is starting not including them in assessment efforts. This is a very common practice. We assume that, as I said, talking to those who come forward and that they allegedly present themselves as representative of a community would know and would represent the needs and the concerns of everybody. So making sure that we are able to include people with disability in our assessment efforts is a good starting point. It's also a good practice to make sure that they can contribute actively in the identification of what would be the best solutions and activities for them. I'm thinking about experiences with older people in Ukraine, where we have been able to have the most active among them as our representatives, as well as those who were able to deliver and identify activities that were in support of older people who were less mobile. And the strategies that they have identified were quite creative and unique, and I was quite surprised because despite of the 10 years in the field, I would have never thought about their solutions. Another negative element that you most of the time find in the field is assuming that people with disability or older people or disadvantaged group, they have no resources and they can be just passive recipients of some sort of aid, whether it's from the agencies or from their families or from the community. So the shift in our approach has to go through this. The people with disability, the older people, children, women, they all are active agents in the process and not passive recipients. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emanuela. I now would like to pass the question to Francesca. It's a question we received from another participant who asks, how do we make sure that humanitarian actions target the most vulnerable?
Thank you so much. Can I just add on what Emanuela said before I answer this question on the common mistakes that we see in a field as far as disability inclusion is concerned? In my experience, one thing that I would like to share is that disability is a complex mix of different factors. So I think that it's important to unpack the disability word into different categories of people, because not all these people living with disabilities have the same needs, and they cannot be seen as one unique group of people. So one thing that we really overlook in many occasions is that this unpacking exercise of who people living with disability are and what kind of disability we are talking about. And one of the more often overlooked categories are people with mental disabilities that are very, very taken into consideration. Thanks. Coming back to the question that Caterina just asked, Caterina, can you please repeat the questions for the participants? Thanks.
Of course. The question is, how do we make sure that humanitarian actions target the most vulnerable?
Well, a good practice should be on the beginning of every crisis to have a joint exercise that involves the affected communities, but also the governments, the UN agencies, and the NGOs, and of vulnerability analysis and vulnerability mapping. And we have to bear in mind that this exercise needs to be undertook in a systematic way and needs to be repeated over time. And this because as the humanitarian crisis evolves, vulnerability evolves. So again, we are back to the concept of vulnerability as a multidimensional and evolving concept. One good example that I've been part of was in Gaza after the last 2014 conflict, where the protection cluster led an exercise to prioritize the most vulnerable person in Gaza for the humanitarian response and produce a document that provided guidance for non-protection actors on how to address protection and vulnerability in their work. So how can they practically address vulnerability in a work that was done by other sectors than protection. And this guide supported practitioners in programming to ensure a protection-based humanitarian response, and could be used alongside with other documents produced by the cluster and across the sector.
Thank you, Francesca. Another topic addressed by Emanuela during the presentation is family separation. Emanuela, one of our participants asks why family separation is that relevant for older people. Is that more relevant for children? Emanuela, if you would like to answer.
Thank you, Caterina. What I wanted to say is that when we look at vulnerabilities, we look at who are the most vulnerable. And in fact, the implication of family separation on children, and I'm sure Francesca then can chip in with some more detailed information about children, and on older people is equally important. The effect on their psychosocial well-being are similar. And the reality is that we have witnessed in the years, and we have had this conversation with the Family Tracing and Reunification Unit at the ICRC a few months ago, looking at the crisis in Ukraine. Family separation is not just the fact that people have been left behind or have moved, have crossed border, but it could be, like in the case of Ukraine, a family separation which is determined by inherent infrastructural issues, such as inability to communicate because of poverty-related elements, or other protection concerns such as freedom of movement, which would not allow older people to cross the contact line in Ukraine and visit their family, and vice versa. And the fact that there are disruptions in the infrastructure, the separation gets quite evident. So the implications at their psychological level are quite significant. And I would like to include another element, especially for older people, and especially when we look at the older among the older people. So those people 75 and above, the impact of not having any contact with their family members is extremely difficult and can trigger mental health conditions that were not present before. We have listened to a number of women talking about cry spellings and talking about feelings of depression and inability to engage in any social activities because they were not able to communicate with their family members, or they were not able to track where their family members were. So there are elements that we should consider and are extremely important when we look at family separation and older people as well as children. So I would not I would not prioritize between children and older people or people with disability, but I would consider them at the same level. So a good practice would be, when we work on family reunification, family separation, family tracing, consider the vulnerable groups and who might be in need of these kind of services. Thank you.
Thank you, Emanuela. Francesca, did you want to add anything to this, to Emanuela's answer?
Well, not really. As Emanuela said, it's not really a matter of prioritizing. It is true that children separated for the families and children in general have better tools to be reunited with their families. There are mandated agencies for this. There are international protocols and procedures that help for this, while older people are not protected the same way from the legal framework. And this absolutely makes a huge difference.
Thank you, Francesca. Regrettably, we have reached the limit of our time for this webinar today. I would like to mention that you will be able to contact our speakers via email. We will shortly share their contact details with you for any follow-up questions. We received, of course, many more very good questions we would like to answer, but unfortunately we do not have time. I just would like to acknowledge a very good comment we received from Ricardo, who says that in exercise 2, we were asked to assess who was vulnerable, but not to what. And for example, in the case of the child with staff, it could be vulnerable to other types of risks. So the importance of always talking about risks and including risk in an exercise and analysis of the protection concerns, as vulnerability can always be potential. It will always depend on the specific risks that that person is facing in the specific context. So thank you very much, Ricardo, for this comment. Before we sign off, I wanted to answer another question that was referring to the possibility of receiving some specific literature and additional resources. As you can see in the slide, we've listed some important resources that we recommend to further your knowledge and your ability to respond to specific needs of people, of older people and people with disability. Once again, should you want to know more, in addition to the webinars and the resources that are available on Disaster Ready, we encourage you to get in touch with our guest experts. Finally, I would like to thank Emanuela and Francesca for this very interesting and interactive presentation. I think that we all appreciated very much the exercises and the engagement through the checks and the crosses during the exercises. I would also like to thank our colleagues behind the scenes, namely Irene at HelpAge, Anna and Stacey at Disaster Ready, and all the others who supported the production of this webinar. Lastly, I would like to remind you that this is the third in a series of thematic webinars on aging, disability, inclusion, and humanitarian action. You can find past webinars on disasterready.org or on the YouTube channel. The webinars, very importantly, complement e-learning modules on aging and disability in humanitarian settings that were developed as part of the APCAP program and are available for free on disasterready.org. Should you need further information on APCAP, the webinars, or disasterready.org, do not hesitate to contact us. So with this, I would like to thank you all once again for your active engagement throughout this hour, as well as my colleagues who made this webinar possible. We are now signing off from Geneva, Rome, and London. Have a beautiful day. Goodbye.